There are men in this world whose names you don't say out loud in certain rooms. Not because they're myths, not because they're ghosts, but because the people who've met them in the wrong circumstances, the ones who looked them in the eye when they shouldn't have, who raised their voice at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, those people have a way of going very quiet afterward. Permanently quiet. Riker Dunn was that kind of man, and on a Thursday evening in late October, he was sitting in the corner booth of Hargreaves. The kind of restaurant where the wine list is thicker than most people's mortgages, and the waitstaff are trained never to make eye contact unless invited. Eating his dinner alone, the way he preferred it, when a girl spilled an entire tray of drinks on the table beside him. The crash was spectacular. 4 glasses of sparkling water, 2 gin and tonics, and a bowl of bread rolls that scattered across the hardwood like small catastrophes. The restaurant, which had been humming with the kind of polite, careful noise that expensive places cultivate, went dead silent. Every head turned. And then every head turned away again, because the man sitting at the table where the drinks had landed was now standing, and the look on his face was the kind that made people find somewhere else to look very quickly. But the girl didn't look away. She stood in the wreckage of her tray, her dark hair half escaped from its bun, a cloth napkin still dangling from her hand, and she looked straight at the man who was now towering over her, red-faced, suit soaked through at the lapels, voice already climbing, and she didn't flinch. Her name was Piper Oakes. She was 22 years old. She had been working double shifts at Hargreaves for 11 months to pay off her mother's medical debt, and she had never, not once, dropped a tray. Until tonight, and tonight, of all nights, she'd dropped it on the wrong table. If you're new here, welcome to Sadie's Romance Library. Hit that subscribe button, because this one's going to stay with you. The man whose jacket was now dripping gin onto the floor of Hargreaves was named Preston Alcott. He was 37, a senior partner at a Bay Street investment firm, and he had the particular kind of confidence that comes not from earning respect, but from never having been told no in a setting where it actually cost him something. He had brought his girlfriend, Meredith, to dinner specifically to tell her she was an embarrassment. He hadn't used those words yet. He'd been building to them slowly over the appetizers, the way he always did, the little comments about her clothes, her posture, the way she'd laughed too loudly at something the host said when they walked in. Meredith worked as a dental hygienist in Etobicoke. Preston had introduced her to his colleagues once, at a firm event, and spent the next 2 weeks carefully letting her know how badly she'd performed. Meredith was 30 years old and had spent the last 14 months convincing herself that Preston's version of love was just how people loved when they came from a certain kind of family. She was wrong, but she hadn't figured that out yet. When the tray came down, Preston was mid-sentence, something cutting about the way Meredith had ordered her food, and the cold gin hitting his jacket stopped him completely. He stood so fast his chair scraped back against the floor. What in the hell? Piper Oakes was already crouching to pick up the glasses. I'm so sorry, sir. I'm incredibly sorry. Don't touch anything. Preston's voice was the kind of quiet that's actually much louder than shouting. Do you understand what you've just done? Do you have any idea what this jacket cost? Piper straightened. She had the particular posture of someone who was used to holding herself very still under pressure. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes direct. She'd learned it from her mother, who'd had to practice it in doctors' offices for the last 3 years. I'll get the manager, she said. We'll have the jacket dry cleaned. You'll pay for it? Preston's voice cracked on the word like he'd never heard anything more absurd. He looked her up and down, the sensible black uniform, the worn shoes, the escaped hair, and something in his face settled into a particular kind of contempt. On a server's salary? What is that, 16 an hour? This jacket is $700, sweetheart. Meredith reached across the table. Preston. He didn't look at her. What kind of establishment hires people who can't carry a tray? Is this your first week? First day? He turned to the nearest table, to the 2 older women sitting there who had stopped pretending not to watch. Incredible. This is what passes for fine dining now. Piper did not look at the floor. That was the thing Riker Dunn noticed first, from his corner booth 8 feet away. She did not look at the floor. Her jaw was tight and her face had gone very still in the way that faces do when someone is holding something back that they cannot afford to release, but her eyes stayed level, stayed on the man. "I've apologized, sir," she said. "The restaurant will cover the cleaning and any additional." "I don't want your apology." Preston leaned in slightly. "I want you to understand what you are. You're a girl who can't do a simple job correctly. That's it. That's the ceiling. And I think everyone in this room can see that now, don't you?" The silence in the restaurant had reached the particular texture of held breath. Meredith had gone the color of the tablecloth, and Riker Dunn set down his fork. This is the part of the story where most people looked away. Most people in that restaurant. The couples, the business dinners, the older gentleman by the window who'd flinched visibly at the crash. They all found something else to be interested in. Their menus, their phones, the middle distance. Riker Dunn looked straight ahead. He was 41 years old. He had a face that was difficult to read, not blank exactly, but still in the way that very old lakes are still, with no indication of what's underneath the surface or how deep it goes. He wore dark clothes, no tie. The two men at the small table near the door, the ones who'd been nursing the same drinks for 40 minutes, were his, and they were watching him the way animals watch a storm front move in. People in certain circles in Toronto knew the name Riker Dunn, the way they knew the names of things that operated outside the normal rules: taxes, gravity, the particular anxiety of a phone call at 3 in the morning. He had interests in construction, in imports, in 3 legitimate restaurants, and 2 that served purposes that didn't appear on any city permit. He had never been charged with anything. He had been investigated twice, and both times the investigations had quietly closed. He was not, by any reasonable definition of the word, a good man. But he had a daughter. Her name was Celia. She was 16, and she waited tables herself on weekends at a breakfast place in the annex because she'd told him she wanted to understand how money worked before she had any of it. He'd argued with her for 2 weeks and then let her do it because Celia had her mother's stubbornness, and her mother was the only person in 30 years who had ever successfully argued Riker Dunn into anything. Her mother had been gone for 4 years now. Riker watched the server, this Piper Oakes, though he didn't know her name yet, stand very straight in front of a man who was trying to make her small, and he thought about Celia standing behind a counter at 7 in the morning, and the particular kind of man who saw a woman doing service work and decided that was an invitation. He picked up his glass of water. He stood up. Preston Alcott was mid-sentence. Something about escalating the complaint to the owner. Something about people like her not understanding consequences. When the man from the corner booth appeared at his elbow, Preston turned, the words already arranged on his tongue, the practiced look of someone preparing to deal with an interruption. And then he stopped. It wasn't anything Riker Dunn said. He hadn't said anything yet. It was the quality of the stillness around him, the way the 2 men near the door had both turned toward the room, the way the maitre had appeared at the edge of his vision, and then taken one visible step backward. It was the specific, careful way the man was looking at him. "You're finished," Riker said. 2 words, conversational in volume, completely without inflection. Preston blinked. "Excuse me? You're finished speaking to her." Riker set his water glass down on Preston's table with a small, precise click. "You've been heard. Dinner's over." Preston was a man who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in most rooms. He was also, though he would never have admitted this, quite good at reading a room when something shifted, the reflexive social instinct that had kept him successfully navigating Bay Street politics for 15 years. And something in this room had shifted in a way that he couldn't quite locate or name, but that his body was responding to before his brain caught up. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, and was annoyed to hear his voice come out slightly less certain than he'd intended. Riker looked at him, just looked. "But this doesn't involve you," Preston continued. "This is between me and the management of this restaurant, and I don't appreciate Henry." Riker didn't raise his voice, didn't turn his head. The maitre d' materialized from somewhere. "Yes, Mr. Dunn, Mr." Preston glanced toward the maitre d', caught the expression on his face, and something cold moved through him. "What is this?" "Mr. Alcott's bill." Riker reached into his jacket and produced a card, which he placed on the table without looking at it. Closed out. His reservation is canceled. He won't be returning. Henry took the card with the careful efficiency of a man who has learned to move quickly in certain situations. Of course, Mr. Dunn. Preston's face had gone through several colors. You can't. This is a public establishment. You don't have the authority to. You have 2 minutes to get your coat, Riker said, before I ask the gentleman by the door to help you with that. The gentleman by the door, who had not moved, somehow became much more visible. Meredith had pushed back her chair. She was watching Riker Dunn with an expression that was difficult to parse. Relief and fear, and something that might have been the very first stages of clarity, arriving about 14 months too late. Preston looked at his girlfriend, looked at the server, who still hadn't looked at the floor, looked at the man standing beside his table with the water glass, and the particular quality of patient stillness that said, very clearly, that he had done this before, and there was no version of this conversation that ended in Preston's favor. He picked up his jacket. He left. The restaurant exhaled. Piper Oaks stood in the quiet aftermath with a broken tray at her feet and the distinct sensation of having survived something she hadn't fully understood while it was happening. The man, tall, dark jacket, the kind of calm that felt like weather, turned to look at her. Not at her the way Preston Alcott had looked at her, like she was a problem or a punchline. Just looked the way you might look at someone you were actually trying to see. You all right? He said. It was such an ordinary question that she almost laughed. I think so. She looked down at the tray, at the scattered remnants of the drinks order. I still have to tell the kitchen that table 12 needs their water replaced, so. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, maybe, a small change in the angle of his mouth that, on a different face, might have been more obvious. You've got good instincts, he said. I dropped a full tray in the most expensive restaurant in the city. You didn't look at the floor. He said it like it meant something. People who are used to being made to feel small, they look at the floor. You didn't. Piper Oaks looked at him for a moment. He was watching her with an attention that was different from how Preston Alcott had watched her. No inventory being taken, no calculation of worth. Just attention. Actual attention. I've had practice, she said finally. He nodded once. I know. He went back to his table. He finished his dinner. He left before she'd finished her shift. She thought, briefly, that that was the end of it. She was wrong. The next morning, Piper Oaks arrived at Hargreaves for the start of her Thursday opening shift to find Marcus, the floor manager, waiting for her at the staff entrance with an expression she couldn't read. You're not in trouble, he said immediately, which was the first indication that she had reason to think she might be. But there's something you should know. The jacket, it turned out, had been a non-issue. Henri had personally reached Preston Alcott before he'd made it to his car, the way Hargreaves handled things, and the complaint had been quietly withdrawn. There was no incident report. There was no disciplinary record. As far as the restaurant's official history was concerned, Thursday evening had proceeded without incident. What there was, sitting on Marcus's desk in the small manager's office behind the kitchen, was a plain white envelope with her name on it. Piper Oaks, handwritten, no return address. Opened because Marcus had thought it might be a complaint and had opened it before he'd noticed it was addressed to her personally. Inside was a card, cream-colored, heavy stock, one phone number and one line, for the dry cleaning bill. RD, there was also beneath the card, $500 in cash. Piper stood in the office doorway and looked at the envelope for a long moment. Marcus, she said carefully, what do you know about someone with the initials RD? Marcus looked at her, the particular look of a man deciding how much to say. I know, he said slowly, that when Hargreaves had a fire 2 years ago and the insurance was stalling, someone made a phone call and the insurance wasn't stalling anymore. He paused. I also know that Henri would walk through traffic for that man, and Henri is not a person who commits easily. Piper looked at the card. Is he dangerous? She asked. I think, Marcus said, that depends entirely on where you're standing. She didn't call the number. Not right away. She went back to work. She covered her shifts. She sent half of her paycheck to her mother's billing department and kept the rest for rent and groceries. Same as always. She tucked the envelope into the drawer of her nightstand where she kept the things she wasn't sure what to do with. She thought about the man in the corner booth, at odd moments, on the subway home, in the 20 minutes between the end of her shift and the start of the walk to her bus stop when it was raining, which it was every day that week, because this was October in Toronto, and October in Toronto does not compromise. She thought about what he'd said. People who are used to being made to feel small, they look at the floor. She'd never had anyone name it before, just that. Her mother called on Sunday. Her name was Joanne Oakes, and she was 54 and had been managing a heart condition and a cascade of related complications for 3 years with the particular combinations of grace and stubbornness that Piper had grown up trying to replicate. She didn't know about the incident at the restaurant. Piper didn't tell her. Joanne would have worried, and worrying wasn't good for her, and anyway there was nothing to tell, really. Someone had been unkind. Someone else had intervened. Piper had gone home. "You sound tired," her mother said. "I'm fine, Mum. You always say that. It's usually true, Piper." Her mother's voice, even over the phone, had a quality to it, not stern exactly, but the specific weight of someone who knew you well enough to see past the words. "Something's different. Nothing's different." A pause. "I'm going to pretend I believe you, but I want you to know I don't." That was so perfectly her mother that Piper laughed, and the laugh cracked something open in her chest that she hadn't realized was sealed. "There was a situation at work," she said. "It was handled. I'm fine." "Who handled it?" A beat of silence. "Someone," Piper said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good," she said simply. "Good." She called the number on a Wednesday evening, standing in her kitchen with her coat still on, because she'd been holding the card for 20 minutes trying to decide, and it was either call or go to bed, and she was too tired to sleep. It rang twice. "Oakes." Not a question. She blinked. "You knew it was me? I have a good memory for loose ends." The voice was the same as she remembered, low, without particular inflection. "How's your mother?" Piper went very still. "How do you know about my mother?" "Hargreaves keeps staff records." Pause. "I don't look at things I don't have reason to look at. You've been covering someone else's shifts for 3 months. The kind of schedule you're keeping has a reason. I made an assumption. She should have found that alarming. She noted that she didn't." "She's okay," Piper said. "Managing. The bill I left. I'm not taking $500 from someone I don't know." A silence. Then, "Fair. But I wanted to say thank you," she said, "for what you did, for just the way you handled it." She stopped. Started again. "Nobody does that. In my experience, nobody does that." He was quiet for a moment. "He bothers you again," Reicherton said finally. "You call this number." "He won't. He's the kind of person who needs an audience. People like that have long memories." "So do I." She said it simply and meant it. Another pause. This one felt different from the others, less empty. "What are you doing Saturday?" he asked. "Working after." Piper looked at her kitchen wall, at the calendar with the shifts marked in different colors, at the note tape beside it that said Mum's Cardiology Nov 12, "Don't forget." "Why?" she said. "There's a thing I'd like to show you." He said it like it was obvious, or like he was surprised it needed explaining. "It doesn't require anything from you. I'm not a man who calls in favors. You're a man who drops $500 on a server's nightstand and knows her mother's medical history from a staffing file." A beat. "Point taken," he said. "What's the thing you'd like to show me?" "My daughter runs a breakfast service Saturday mornings," he said, "out of a church hall in the annex. For families. She organized it herself. She's been trying to get donations from local businesses, and she's running into walls because she's 16 and people don't take her seriously." He stopped. She could use someone who knows how to talk to people, who knows how to hold themselves in a room. Piper said nothing for a moment. "Someone who doesn't look at the floor," she said quietly. "Yes." She looked at the calendar again. "Saturday," she said. "What time?" Celia Dunn was exactly what Piper had not expected, which was to say she was completely herself. 17 months of quiet determination inside the body of a girl who looked like she'd been assembled from pieces of a much more interesting person than most people her age. She had her father's stillness, and something else her father didn't have, some quality of open warmth that made you feel, within 4 minutes of meeting her, that she had been genuinely interested in your arrival. She met Piper at the door of St. Anne's Church Hall on a Saturday morning in November, when the street was still gray with early light, and she shook her hand like an adult, and she said, "Dad told me you were good at standing your ground. That's what I need." Piper looked at her for a moment. "He said that?" "He doesn't say a lot of things," Celia said, "but when he does, they're specific." She held the door open. "Come in. I'll show you what we've got." What they had was 47 families registered for the morning service, a kitchen running on 4 volunteers and Celia's force of will, and a shortfall in donations because 2 of the local restaurant suppliers had backed out after someone. Celia suspected Preston Alcott, though she said his name the way you say the name of something mildly unpleasant, had apparently made a call to someone who knew someone. "He found out Dad was involved," Celia said, arranging bread in the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for months. "I don't know how. He can't come after Dad directly, so he's coming after this." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "I need to replace 2 suppliers by next Saturday. I have 4 meetings and I need someone who can come in with me and not look nervous." "Why would I look nervous?" Celia glanced at her. "You wouldn't," she said. "That's why I asked." Riker Dawn arrived at the church hall at 9:30, when the service was in full swing, and the room had reached the kind of noise that meant something was working. He stood at the back of the hall, out of the way, against the wall, and watched his daughter move through the room with a plate of toast in each hand, and a conversation going with 3 different people simultaneously. Piper Oakes was at the front with 2 women from the church council explaining something. Her posture was the same as it had been at Hargreaves, level, unhurried. She had a way of speaking to people that made them feel that their concern was the most reasonable thing she'd heard all morning, even when she was in the middle of disagreeing with them. He'd watched people manage rooms his whole life. It was something you either understood or you didn't. She understood it. She looked up at some point and saw him standing at the back of the hall. She didn't wave or change the conversation she was in. She just acknowledged him with a small shift of expression and went back to what she was doing. He stayed for an hour. He didn't speak to her. He didn't approach. He stayed because his daughter was in the room, and the room was going well, and there were few enough things in his life that he could say that about. Preston Alcott made his move 3 weeks later. It was, as these things often are, more petty than strategic. An anonymous complaint filed with the city's Food Service Inspection Office, timed to arrive on the same week as Celia's November fundraiser. The complaint cited vague violations in the church hall kitchen. It was the kind of complaint that gets taken seriously enough to require a response, and not seriously enough to actually shut anything down, but it doesn't need to shut anything down to do damage. Delays do damage. Uncertainty does damage. The families who'd been counting on Saturday service do damage when they arrive and the doors are locked. Piper found out on a Tuesday from Celia by text at 6:30 in the morning before her own shift. The inspection is Friday, 2 days before the fundraiser. "I don't know how to fight this." Piper sat with the phone for a moment. Then she called the number. "I know," Riker said when he picked up. "He's targeting her. I know. Is there something you can do?" A pause. Not hesitation. He didn't hesitate the way other people did. She'd noticed, like he wasn't waiting to decide but waiting for the right moment to say what he'd already decided. "There are things I could do," he said, "that I won't do, because Celia doesn't need to build something on that kind of foundation." Piper was quiet. "But you," he said, "can do something I can't." "What's that?" "You can call the inspection office," he said. "As a concerned community member, you can submit documentation of the kitchen's compliance. You can get statements from the 47 families who've been using the service. You can make it very clear, through completely legitimate channels, that someone is filing a bad faith complaint and that there will be attention on this file." A beat. "I also," he added, "may have mentioned to a city councilor that I'm aware of the situation." "How do you know a city councilor?" "He needed a building permit in 2019. Piper decided not to pursue that line of questioning. "Okay," she said, "I'll start making calls." The inspection came. The inspector found nothing, because there was nothing to find, because Celia Dunn ran a clean kitchen and kept our records with the kind of precision that suggested she was going to be absolutely terrifying in whatever she chose to do with her life. The complaint was closed. The fundraiser went ahead. 47 families became 61 because the story of the complaint had circulated through the neighborhood in the way that stories about fairness always circulate, quietly, with heat, and people had showed up anyway, out of the particular Canadian stubbornness that arrives when someone tries to close something that shouldn't be closed. Piper was there. She'd worked the morning service, and she'd stayed through cleanup, and she was pulling on her coat by the back door when Riker appeared in the hallway. They stood there for a moment. The noise of the hall, people leaving, chairs scraping, Celia's voice somewhere above it all, filtered through the walls. "She did it," Piper said. "She did," he said. "You know she doesn't need you to fix things for her." "I know." He said it without defensiveness. "I learned that a long time ago." He looked at her for a moment. "She needs people around her who understand that. It's rarer than it should be." Piper buttoned her coat. She looked at him, the stillness, the careful attention he had even in a hallway, the way he took up space without performing it. "Why me?" she said. "Of all the people you could have, from wherever you come from, with whatever you have access to, why ask me?" He thought about this. She could see him actually thinking about it, not reaching for an easy answer. "Because you were the only person in that room," he said, "who looked at a man trying to make someone small and thought, no, not because it was your business, not because you had anything to gain, just no." She held his gaze. "I do that a lot," she said quietly. "It usually doesn't go well for me." "I know." Something in his face moved, the lake still surface shifting just slightly. "I'd like that to change." She stood there in the hallway of a church hall in the annex in November, with the sound of 61 families behind the wall and her coat half-buttoned, and she looked at Riker Dunn, who was not a good man, exactly, but was something more complicated and perhaps more true, and she thought about her mother saying good with such simple certainty over the phone. She thought about Celia shaking her hand like an adult and saying, "That's what I need." She thought about the way he'd said "you're finished" and set down a water glass and made a room understand without raising his voice that there were limits. She thought about looking at the floor and not doing it. "Okay," she said, "just that." But he understood it, she could tell, the way he understood most things, completely, and without needing it said twice. Preston Alcott, for what it's worth, had a difficult November. Two of his firm's largest clients, both of whom had interests that overlapped in certain logistical ways with the business concerns of a man named Riker Dunn, quietly redirected their portfolios in December. He was never able to establish why. He suspected, but suspicion wasn't evidence, and evidence was the one thing he wasn't going to find, because there was none. There was only the particular experience of realizing that a room had been quietly rearranged around you while you were looking the other way. He didn't go back to Hargreaves. He also, eventually, stopped calling Meredith. That was its own small mercy, the kind that arrives sideways, through circumstance, without anyone having to ask for it. Meredith, for her part, went back to the breakfast place in the annex for a while. Not on the Saturdays when the service was running. She didn't want to intrude on that. But on the quiet Tuesday mornings when the place was half empty, and the light came in off the street, in a way that made everything look a little gentler than it actually was. She saw Celia Dunn once, behind the counter. They didn't know each other. They just exchanged the particular nod of two people who have survived the same difficult weather and come out the other side, still standing. Joanne Oakes met Riker Dunn for the first time at Christmas, in the small apartment in Scarborough where Piper had grown up, at a dinner that Piper had described to him as casual, but had spent 3 days preparing for. Joanne was wearing her good cardigan and had made her opinion of men very clear to her daughter in the preceding week, in the way of mothers everywhere, through indirection, implication, and the strategic deployment of silence. She met him at the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Riker Dunn," he said. "Joanne Oakes," she said. "I know who you are." He nodded. He didn't look surprised. "I know your reputation," Joanne said. "I know what people say about you. Some of it's accurate," he said. Joanne was quiet for a moment. She was 54 years old and she had been through a great deal, and she had the particular clarity of a person who has spent time considering what actually matters versus what merely sounds like it matters. My daughter, she said, doesn't look at the floor for anyone. I know, Riker Dunn said. That's why I'm here. Joanne Oakes looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. The roast needs another 20 minutes, she said. You can set the table. So here's what I want to ask you, and I mean this genuinely, because I've been thinking about it since I started telling you this story. There are people in this world who walk into a room and look for the exit, and there are people who walk into a room and look for whoever's being pushed toward the wall. Piper Oakes was the second kind. Not because she was fearless, she wasn't. Not because she had nothing to lose, she had everything to lose. But because, somewhere along the way, she'd decided that the cost of looking at the floor was higher than the cost of not. And isn't that the question, really? Every time someone makes you feel like you're the smallest person in the room, aren't you choosing, in that moment, what you're going to do with your eyes? If this story got you, drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been the person who didn't look away? Or have you been the person who wished they hadn't? I read every single one. And if you're new to Sadie's Romance Library, subscribe, because we do this every week. We tell the stories about the people who choose difficult over easy, honest over safe, and who somehow, against the odds, find someone who sees them doing it and thinks, there, that one. See you in the next one.